Hello. Well, in this presentation I want to talk about some very general ideas related to how do you write an introduction? How do you write an introduction to social scientific research? Okay, and this is my name, Michael Strange. I'm from the Department of Society and Globalization at Roskilde University in Denmark. And my email, if you want to contact me after watching this, is mstrand@rook.dk. Okay, let's begin. So, the introduction, what does it do? Well, first of all, what it does is it tells the reader, represented here by the nice clip art, the how and the what of your project. So what is it that you're going to do? What is it that they're meant to read here? How are they meant to read this as well? Because how, of course, is how are you going to develop your research problem? But for the reader, they want to see just how are they actually going to read your text? How are they meant to understand it? What are the things they're meant to be thinking about when they read it? What are the main points that they need to focus upon? What do they need to bear in mind? Also, what knowledge do they need to have in order to understand what you're telling them? Okay. Also, of course, then, when you explain the how and the what to the reader, this is where you explain what is your research problem and what is your argument. The research problem and the argument are in a couplet. They come together. It's the yin and the yang in a sense. That you have your research problem. In response to this research problem, I will argue this. In the introduction, you need to set up this relationship, because this productive relationship between the problem and the argument is what's going to drive the entire project. So if you get that right, it's going to make the reading process so much easier for the reader, but also it's going to make the writing process so much easier for you. So get that right in the introduction. Also, of course, what the introduction does is it sets the scene. It sets the scene of, again, what is it that the reader's meant to be thinking about? What is the field in which you're working in? The theoretical field, the empirical field? What other kind of studies have been done in this field? Also, is this a very topical issue that you're dealing with? Are there political speeches being made right now? Has there been a speech made very recently, a couple of years ago? Or is this more kind of an historical field that you're working in? Basically, what is the scene in which you're working? Okay, so as an example, this might be the beginning of an introduction. So this is where we set the scene. So to read it off, your text might begin, when the United Nations was created, it was seen to promise a new form of global security. Though its record has been mixed, this role was reasserted with the fall of the Soviet Union and talk of a new world order, built on the basis of international organizations like the United Nations. So again, you set the scene. You introduce some key buzzwords which help establish a certain idea of what you're going to be talking about. It narrows down the possible focus, narrows down the world so that it's something about the United Nations, it's about global security, it's about the Soviet Union or the context of the aftermath of the Soviet Union. Also the talk of a new world order, and also in respect again to the United Nations international organization. So that tells the reader an awful lot already about your empirical context and also your theoretical context. Okay, having set the scene of your research, you might write something like, however, the largely unilateral decision of the United States to invade Iraq in 2003 was seen by many commentators to indicate the decline of the United Nations. Reference, of course, to that. How should the status of the United Nations as a pillar of global security be understood today? So you have your paradox. You have the however, there is something going on. There's something we don't quite know. There's some kind of mystery here. Commentators, again, it's topical. And you can even find that sometimes you can phrase your research problem so it comes down into a question very early on, a question which is going to be a way of structuring your project that follows, your text that follows, but also again, it's a way of holding the shoulders of the reader, making sure they stay focused, making sure they don't get lost, making sure also they don't misunderstand your text and think you're writing about something else which you're not, so that when you get questioned about what you've written, you're being questioned about what you have actually written, not about what someone else has read. Okay, so the paradox then, the research problem looks always something like this. So it's, this is the research puzzle that's driving your project. So A says X, but B says Y. So what's going on? A might be a theory, it might be an empirical event, whatever. Same thing with B. The point is that these two different things tell slightly different stories. When you put them together, you end up with a paradox, a sort of conflict, a tension, and this tension is productive because it drives the project. It says, why is this interesting? And it's this tension that you can keep on coming back to say, my project has something to tell you. It's interesting to read. Okay. Next line then of this hypothetical introduction. In order to understand the contemporary role of the United Nations in security, this thesis will attempt to assess its role in what has been called the War on Terror. So again, you narrowed down your focus, and this is where you begin to develop your response to the research problem. In order to understand this issue, this thing we don't know about, this mystery, this thesis, and you begin to explain very broadly what you're going to be doing, but it narrows it down all the time. Next, the War on Terror is a broad and controversial term. However, it is clearly associated with a number of activities, including the US-led invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, domestic counter-terrorism, and the freezing of finances seen to support terrorism. Well, okay, here we have a list of three. Lists of three, always nice. Everybody likes the number three. Also, through providing a list of three, you're listing a series of concrete things that you're going to be studying. So again, you've narrowed down what you're doing. You've narrowed down the focus. You've made the reader more confident of what you're saying. They have a better idea of what they're meant to read. But also you've given yourself a structure, a focus. You can say, okay, first of all I have to do this thing, then the second thing, and then the third thing. And you can work with that structure throughout the project. Afterwards, then, you might say, the thesis will utilise both social scientific literature, news sources, and other relevant documents to compare the role of the United Nations as a security provider in each of these cases. This doesn't add an awful lot, but it does, again, help both narrow down your focus, but also it begins to hint at the methodology. It begins to explain to the reader that I have a research problem and I have a clear idea of how I'm going to do this research. I have an understanding about how to do social science. To show that you know how to do social science is, of course, one of the most important things you need to do whenever you are writing anything within social science, certainly as a student. Okay, afterwards then, through the analysis, the paper will argue that the security role of the United Nations has actually increased in the period in which the War on Terror has been a dominant paradigm in global security debates. Okay, what do you have here? Well, you have an argument. You are developing the other side of your problem argument couplet. You're showing this is your response to the problem. Another trick demonstrated in this quotation here is also that you've said, well, okay, normally people might think this, but actually contrary to this, actually what has happened is this. That you show that you have the ability through your analysis to show that something less obvious has happened, something interesting is actually going on. This is about communication, this is about writing. How do you communicate that your text is interesting? You have to show to the reader why this is exciting, why is it worth their time to read your project. Alternatively to your argument, you might write that the thesis will conclude that whilst the security role of the United Nations has been widely seen as in decline, in fact the contrary is the case. The war on terror has led to a vastly increased security mandate for the United Nations. Again, you've got this contrary aspect, this sense that you're going to tell something more than the obvious story. It's interesting. But the difference here is that whereas in the previous example you'd said you were going to argue this particular thing that you're going to argue, here you're just referring much more directly to the conclusion. In conclusion, so there's no argument really either side about whether or not you should go for, when you say we will argue, whether you should say I will argue this or whether you should say we will conclude this. But it's just to give you two examples that you could use in explaining that other side of the problem argument couplet. And then you might also want to say, give a reference to the literature. So, as the literature review will show, academics have looked at each of these different perspectives in detail. However, currently there remains a need for the overview produced in this dissertation. The value of that is that you argue that you're stating that there is added value to your project. That your project is bringing something extra to a field that already exists, and also you're contextualizing it within a certain literature. Of course, this quotation here is very general. In reality, if you were writing a bit like this, you would rather refer to, you would give at least some names to illustrate which academics you're talking about, which fields you're referencing here. Okay, so just to conclude then, the most important aspects when you write your introduction are: one, that you need to find the role and purpose of your thesis, both for you, but also, very importantly, for the reader. When you actually write your introduction, you might write a rough introduction at the beginning of your overall writing process, but usually you won't write the proper introduction until the very end of that process. But still, you need to produce some kind of sketchy notes outlining to yourself what is the role, the purpose of this thesis, because that's going to provide the structure that's going to help you know what is relevant to say and what isn't relevant. It's going to help make the writing process so much easier. Okay, so point number 2, it does this, it tells the reader the role and purpose of your thesis via providing this problem and this argument. So, does your introduction give a problem and an argument? If it doesn't, you need to do more work on it. If it does and it's clear and the reader can understand that, then it is going to be a very good introduction. And also, you are a communicator. So how do you get the reader focused and interested? What sort of reader are you working with here? What sort of field might they be from? But the tricks just given in the quotations just before, things like trying to make it clear that it's topical, that it relates maybe to some broader debate, that your problem relates to a broader debate, a broader field, maybe some political speeches, some very recent topical events, but also maybe that you are adding something, that you are showing that there is another way, another perspective to the obvious one, that not just anybody could do what you're going to do in this project, because you've got some special understanding, you've used certain theories, and that's going to make reading this process interesting, reading this report interesting. Okay, so that's basically how to do an introduction. And the final thing to say, as always, is have fun with your paper. Thank you.